When the world remembers George Harrison, we think of the quiet Beatle, calm, spiritual, and searching for meaning beyond fame. But what audiences never saw was the fire beneath that calm exterior. Behind the gentle smile, George carried a secret list, not of friends, but of rivals, disappointments, and even idols he grew to despise. From bandmates like John Lennon and Paul McCartney, to legends like Elvis Presley and Neil Young, George's grudges were sharp, personal, and unforgettable. And one man, above all, earned his deepest resentment. This is the story George never forgave. As a boy in Liverpool, George's life was transformed by a sound drifting from a nearby house. It was Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. Just a few notes were enough to flip a switch inside him. From that moment, rock and roll wasn't just music, it was destiny. Elvis became his hero, a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and possibility. But by the 1970s, when George finally met his idol, the man he saw wasn't the raw, electrifying Elvis of his youth. Instead, he encountered a performer in a glittering jumpsuit, drowned in trumpets and backup singers on the grand Las Vegas stage. Afterward, George sighed to friends, "I just wanted to tell him, put on some jeans, a black shirt, drop the backup singers, and go play That's All Right, Mama like you used to." Word of this made its way back to Elvis, who dismissed it with a cold smile, muttering, "If he thinks I'm going back to little bars just to please somebody, he doesn't know a thing about Elvis Presley." For George, it was heartbreaking, the realization that purity had been replaced by spectacle. His relationship with Paul McCartney told another story of love and disappointment. In the early days of the Beatles, George and Paul were inseparable. Just two boys on a bus, passing guitars back and forth, fingers raw from practicing chords. Paul called George his kid brother, but by the time Sk Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band hit in 1967, Paul's dominance was clear. His relentless control began to suffocate George, who was allowed only a handful of songs per album despite his growing skill as a songwriter. By the time of the Abbey Road sessions, George finally stood his ground. He refused Paul's endless changes and once told him bluntly, "I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney." He later admitted, "Paul has ruined me as a guitar player." Their relationship was strained, but never completely broken. Beneath the rivalry lingered an undeniable bond, one rooted in shared history that neither could erase. The fracture with John Lennon ran even deeper. George had once admired John's wit and fearlessness, but admiration gave way to frustration as John dismissed his music again and again. When George brought in demos, John would shrug and say, "It's fine, but not something I'd listen to." What hurt even more was John's mockery of George's spiritual journey. When George spoke passionately about Indian philosophy and mysticism, John would cut him off with a smirk. "Don't start telling me about those Indian saints again." By the end, their friendship was fractured almost beyond repair. In his memoir I, Me, Mine, George hardly mentioned John at all, a silence that spoke louder than any insult. Though he mourned John after his death, George never sugarcoated their history. Honesty was George's trademark, and sometimes it cut sharply. In 1992, during a recording session with Bob Geldof, he was asked about Neil Young. Without hesitation, George said, "I'm not a Neil Young fan. I hate it. I can't stand it. The main thing is his voice. I like a couple of his songs, but I hate that voice worse than mine." He even mocked Neil's long, distorted guitar solos, calling them laughable. Later that year, they shared a stage at Bobfest, the 30th anniversary concert for Bob Dylan. Backstage, the air was tense. Neil knew about George's comments, but carried on with grace, smiling and performing as though nothing had happened. George remained cool and distant. The divide was unspoken, but unmistakable. His disdain for Pete Townshend of The Who also ran deep. To George, spirituality was sacred, something to be lived sincerely. Townshend often cited the teachings of Meher Baba, but George didn't buy it. In 1966, he told India Today, "Every time I've met him, he's been stoned, talking rubbish. I don't think he's serious about all that religion stuff." The tension grew when Townshend helped Eric Clapton in his pursuit of George's wife Pattie Boyd, a betrayal that inspired Clapton's haunting Layla. George never openly blamed Pete, but the wound was obvious. To him, Townshend wasn't just a rival, he was a false prophet, a man playing dress-up with spirituality. By the 1990s, another generation of musicians found themselves in George's crosshairs. When Oasis exploded onto the scene, hailed by the press as the new Beatles, George had little patience for the comparison. He was even less patient with Liam Gallagher. In 1996, he dismissed him as out of date and rather silly, adding with a sting, "When you see the band without him holding a microphone, he's just excess baggage." True to form, Liam fired back on MTV News, saying, "I still love the Beatles, but I think he's a clown. If I saw him, I'd tell him straight." The feud made headlines, drawing a sharp line between the golden era of British rock and the brash new generation. Perhaps the most complicated relationship was with Elton John. On the surface, they seemed friendly, performing together and sharing stages. But George once said in an interview, Elton John's music, "I've never thought much of it. Every song sounds the same. He wrote one good song years ago. It's all formula." And yet, there was more to their bond than disdain. At a party in the 1970s, George shocked Elton by telling him directly, "For God's sake, cut down on that marching powder." While others laughed or looked away, George was the only one willing to confront Elton about his cocaine use. Years later, Elton admitted he respected George for it, calling him the wise man of the Beatles. Their friendship was built on contradictions, cold yet caring, critical yet honest. All of these stories reveal a side of George Harrison that went far beyond the neat label of the quiet Beatle. Yes, he carried grudges, but they weren't born of cruelty or pettiness. They came from a relentless demand for authenticity. George was a man who couldn't stomach fakery, wasted potential, or selling out for spectacle. He mourned idols who had lost their way to excess, clashed bitterly with bandmates who overshadowed him, and called out the hypocrisy he saw in the industry around him. His honesty often left bruises, but it also revealed just how deeply he cared about truth. George Harrison carried his dislikes with the same passion he carried his music, but those grudges revealed something deeper, his devotion to truth. He wasn't chasing headlines, applause, or fame. He wanted something real, something lasting, something honest, and in that journey, he became far more than the quiet Beatle. He became the uncompromising one, the man who stood firm, even against giants. His music still speaks that truth today. If you were inspired by his story, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more untold stories behind music's greatest legends. Thanks for watching.